7:58 in the morning, January 2nd. In Mexico City, President Claudia Sheinbaum is mid-sentence during a live news conference when the room starts to shake. Cameras keep rolling as people calmly file out of the building, a scene that's become almost routine in a country that's spent decades building institutional muscle memory for exactly this moment. Nearly 200 miles south, in the small coastal town of San Marcos, Guerrero, the same earthquake is tearing through buildings far more violently. Roughly 700 homes damaged. Around 70 of them collapsed outright. A woman killed when her house came down around her. I need you to know exactly where this earthquake struck, because the location is the entire reason scientists have been paying such close attention to this stretch of Mexico's Pacific coast for decades. This magnitude 6.5. Earthquake occurred right at the edge of what seismologists call the Guerrero seismic gap, a roughly 230-kilometer stretch of Mexico's subduction zone that hasn't produced a major magnitude 7+ earthquake since 1911. That's not a typo. More than a century of essentially complete silence, sitting directly between fault segments on either side that rupture regularly, violently, and with a track record that includes one of the deadliest earthquakes in Mexican history. Scientists have spent years building specialized ocean floor monitoring networks specifically to understand why this one segment of the Ring of Fire behaves so differently from everything around it. So today, we're going to walk through what a seismic gap actually is, why Guerrero's specific gap has puzzled researchers for decades, what January's earthquake means for that puzzle, and what scientists are actually watching for as they try to understand one of the most consequential open questions in earthquake science today. Let's get into it. Let's establish the facts of the earthquake itself first. At 7:58 a.m. local time, on January the 2nd, 2026, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck near the town of San Marcos in the Mexican state of Guerrero, northeast of the resort city of Acapulco. The quake occurred at a depth of approximately 18 kilometers, and it lasted around 33 seconds, according to seismic records. 2 people were killed. 1 woman died in San Marcos when her home collapsed on her A-man in Mexico City, died after falling down a stairwell while evacuating a building during the shaking, nearly 170 miles from the epicenter. The town of San Marcos took the brunt of the physical damage, with more than 700 homes affected and an estimated 70 destroyed outright. Maximum shaking intensity reached very strong on the standard intensity scale used to measure earthquake effects at the surface. The quake was felt across the states of Guerrero and Morelos, and clearly enough in Mexico City itself to trigger the capital's seismic alert system and interrupt a presidential press conference on live television. That Mexico City connection deserves its own explanation because it's a genuinely important part of why this region gets watched so closely. Mexico's capital sits atop the ancient, dried lake bed of what was once Lake Texcoco, a soft sediment that behaves almost like gelatin when seismic waves pass through it, amplifying shaking far beyond what the same earthquake would produce on solid bedrock. This exact phenomenon is why the devastating 1985 Michoacan earthquake, which struck the coast hundreds of kilometers away, still managed to kill more than 10,000 people, specifically in Mexico City. January's earthquake, though far smaller than that 1985 disaster, triggered the same amplification effect on a much smaller scale, which is part of why a magnitude 6.5 quake centered near Acapulco could still meaningfully disrupt daily life in a capital city so far removed from the epicenter. The aftershock sequence that followed has been substantial. Mexico's National Seismological Service recorded more than 2,144 aftershocks in the weeks following the main shock, and by January 16th, that total had climbed to roughly 4,700 recorded aftershocks. The largest of these, a magnitude 5.0 event, struck just after midnight on January 16th, once again triggering Mexico City's seismic alert system and rousing residents from sleep, though officials confirmed no additional damage resulted from that specific aftershock. Now let's explain the concept that makes this earthquake's location so significant to seismologists specifically. Mexico's Pacific coast sits along a genuinely active convergent plate boundary, where the Cocos Plate, a relatively small oceanic plate, is being forced beneath the much larger North American plate at the Middle America Trench. This is the same fundamental type of megathrust fault system we've discussed on this channel before with other subduction zones around the Ring of Fire, and it's capable of producing some of the largest earthquakes on the planet. Along most of this Mexican coastline, that plate boundary behaves the way seismologists generally expect a subduction zone to behave. It locks up under accumulating stress for years or decades, then releases that stress periodically in significant earthquakes, a pattern that's produced numerous damaging quakes across Mexico's Pacific states over the past century. A seismic gap, in the language seismologists use, refers to a specific segment of a fault system that has gone conspicuously, unusually quiet compared to the neighboring segments on either side of it, despite sitting on the exact same overall fault structure. The underlying logic is straightforward. If the same tectonic forces are pushing on the entire fault system, but one specific segment simply isn't releasing that stress through periodic earthquakes the way its neighbors are, that segment may be quietly accumulating stress that eventually has to be released somehow. The Guerrero Gap is widely regarded as one of the best known, most intensively studied seismic gaps anywhere in the world, specifically because its silence is so extreme and so well documented. This particular stretch of subduction zone hasn't produced an earthquake of magnitude 7, or greater, since 1911, a genuinely remarkable span of quiet for a fault segment sitting between two neighboring stretches of coastline that have each produced major, damaging earthquakes multiple times within that same window. Mexico also has a second, similarly well-studied seismic gap further southeast, near the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which has been seismically silent for a comparably long stretch since record-keeping began in that specific area. To appreciate just how unusual that 1911 cutoff really is, it helps to know how active the surrounding coastline has been in the meantime. Mexico's Pacific coast, taken as a whole, is one of the most seismically productive subduction zones on Earth, regularly producing earthquakes of magnitude 6 and above, and periodically producing magnitude 7 and 8 class events on the segments directly bordering the Guerrero Gap on both sides. Researchers who first identified this gap decades ago did so precisely because they noticed this glaring absence, a segment sitting in the middle of an otherwise consistently active fault system, surrounded on both sides by neighbors that kept doing exactly what a subduction zone segment is expected to do, while this one stretch simply didn't. Here's where the Guerrero Gap gets genuinely fascinating from a scientific standpoint, because researchers eventually discovered that this segment isn't simply sitting still and quietly building up stress the way a straightforward, overdue fault segment would. Instead, scientists have found that the Guerrero Gap releases a substantial portion of its accumulated tectonic stress through something called slow slip events, sometimes described as silent earthquakes. These are episodes where the two sides of the fault genuinely do slip relative to each other, releasing real measurable strain, but they do it gradually over the course of weeks or months, rather than in the sudden, violent rupture of a conventional earthquake. Because the movement happens so slowly, it produces little or no felt shaking at the surface, even though GPS stations and other precise deformation instruments can clearly detect the ground actually moving during one of these events. This behavior is genuinely unusual compared to the fault segments immediately surrounding the Guerrero Gap, which release their accumulated stress the conventional way through periodic large earthquakes. Researchers have spent years trying to understand exactly why this one stretch of subduction zone behaves so differently, and the honest answer, even after considerable dedicated research, is that scientists don't yet have a complete explanation. A significant international research effort has involved deploying specialized ocean bottom seismometers directly offshore of the Guerrero coast, instruments capable of detecting activity that land-based seismic stations simply can't pick up clearly given their distance from the actual fault interface out, under the ocean. These offshore deployments have led to genuinely new discoveries, including the detection of previously unreported shallow tectonic tremors, and a clearer picture of the seafloor's physical structure in this specific region. A study published just this year specifically examined whether the unusual slip behavior at the Guerrero Gap could be explained by something about the physical structure of the oceanic plate as it enters the subduction zone at this location, essentially asking whether some specific geological feature on the incoming plate might account for why the segment creeps rather than ruptures. The study's central finding, reflected directly in its own title, was that the connection between plate structure and this unusual slip behavior is limited. In plain terms, researchers looked for a straightforward physical explanation and didn't find one, at least not one that fully accounts for what makes this segment behave so differently from its neighbors. That's a genuinely important, if unsatisfying, scientific conclusion because it tells you this remains a real open question in earthquake science, not a solved mystery that just hasn't made it into public awareness yet. To understand why this open scientific question carries such weight, you need to understand what the fault segments directly next to the Guerrero Gap are capable of producing. The most consequential example is the 1985 Michoacan earthquake, a magnitude 8.0 megathrust rupture that struck the segment of Mexico's subduction zone just to the northwest of the Guerrero Gap. That earthquake killed more than 10,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them in Mexico City, hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter, due to exactly the soft soil amplification effect we discussed earlier. It remains one of the deadliest and most consequential earthquakes in modern Mexican history, and it stands as the clearest possible illustration of what this general stretch of subduction zone is fully capable of producing when a segment does rupture in the conventional way. The Guerrero Gap sits directly adjacent to that same general fault system, has been accumulating tectonic stress for more than a century without a comparable release. And researchers studying slow slip behavior have found that even the silent release mechanism doesn't appear to be dissipating stress as completely or as reliably as a full earthquake rupture would. That combination, a century plus of accumulated stress, an incompletely understood release mechanism, and a documented devastating precedent on the immediately adjacent fault segment, is exactly why the Guerrero Gap has drawn sustained scientific attention for decades, well before January's earthquake ever occurred. It's worth understanding why a full megathrust rupture along a segment this size would matter so much more than the earthquakes this region already produces regularly. A subduction zone segment that's gone unusually quiet for a long stretch, whether through complete locking or through only partial stress release via slow slip, has more time to accumulate displacement across a wider fault area before it eventually gives way. Generally speaking, a larger area of fault slipping at once produces a proportionally larger earthquake, following the same basic physics that separates a magnitude 6 event from a magnitude 8.1. If the Guerrero Gap has genuinely been storing meaningful stress since 1911, even partially, the eventual earthquake capable of releasing that accumulated stress could, in principle, rival or exceed the scale of the 1985 Michoacan disaster, striking a coastline that includes not just Acapulco and the surrounding Guerrero communities directly along the coast, but the exact same soft, amplification-prone Mexico City basin that turned a distant 1985 rupture into one of the deadliest earthquakes in the country's modern history. Here's the genuinely important, still unresolved question. Does January's magnitude 6.5 earthquake near San Marcos actually tell us anything about the Guerrero Gap specifically, or was it a separate, if geographically nearby, event? I want to be careful and honest here, the same way we've approached similar questions on this channel with other seismic sequences. San Marcos sits close to the boundary zone of the broader Guerrero coastal segment, and the earthquake's depth and location place it within the same general tectonic setting scientists study when they study the gap. But establishing a confirmed direct mechanical relationship between a specific earthquake and a specific seismic gap's long-term behavior requires the kind of detailed aftershock mapping, focal mechanism analysis, and stress transfer modeling that takes researchers real time to complete properly, not something that can be confirmed within days of the event itself. There's a genuinely useful precedent here from research on Mexico's other major seismic gap at Tehuantepec, further southeast along the same coastline. Following a notable earthquake near that gap, researchers specifically investigated whether the rupture might have relieved some of the accumulated stress sitting in that neighboring silent zone. Their conclusion was genuinely nuanced. The earthquake in question had an unusual origin, starting deep within the subducting plate itself rather than along the main plate interface where a gap-closing earthquake would be expected to occur, which made its actual effect on the gap's stress balance difficult to judge with confidence. One seismologist studying that event put it plainly. It wasn't necessarily the same fault mechanism scientists were expecting to eventually close that particular gap. That same kind of careful mechanism-specific analysis is exactly what's required before anyone can responsibly say whether January's Guerrero earthquake meaningfully altered the stress picture in the broader gap, added to it, or occurred largely independently of it. So what does ongoing monitoring of the Guerrero Gap actually involve day to day? Researchers maintain a network of GPS stations across coastal Guerrero specifically designed to detect the slow, gradual ground movement characteristic of a slow slip event, tracking positions with enough precision to notice centimeter-scale shifts over the course of weeks. The offshore ocean bottom seismometer, deployments we discussed earlier, continue gathering data on shallow tectonic tremors and the detailed seismic structure of the seafloor directly above the subduction interface. Data land-based stations alone can't adequately capture. And seismologists continue tracking the broader earthquake catalog for this stretch of coastline, looking for any change in the pattern of smaller earthquakes that might signal a meaningful shift in how the gap is behaving. What would actually constitute a significant change worth escalated attention? A sustained acceleration in the rate of slow slip events, a shift in their typical location or duration, or, most significantly, seismic activity that shows genuine characteristics of building toward a larger conventional rupture rather than the segment's usual slow, gradual release pattern. None of that has been confirmed as a result of January's earthquake specifically, and researchers remain candid that the fundamental question of why the segment behaves so differently from its neighbors remains scientifically unresolved, even after years of dedicated study. It's worth explaining one more piece of context here, because it directly shaped how January's earthquake actually played out for millions of people, Mexico's seismic alert system. Following the catastrophic 1985 Michoacan disaster, Mexico built what became one of the world's first operational earthquake early warning systems, a network of sensors along the Pacific coast specifically designed to detect an earthquake's initial seismic waves and broadcast an alert to Mexico City and other inland population centers before the more damaging shaking actually arrives. Because seismic waves travel through the ground slower than electronic signals travel through the alert network, this system can provide anywhere from several seconds to, in some cases, over a minute of advance warning, depending on an earthquake's distance from the capital. That system functioned exactly as designed during January's earthquake, triggering alerts and prompting the calm, practiced evacuation footage that circulated from Scheinbaum's own press conference. It functioned again during the magnitude 5.0 aftershock on January 16th. This kind of institutional infrastructure level preparedness is a direct, decades-long legacy of the 1985 disaster, and it's precisely the kind of system regional authorities continue to rely on and refine, specifically because of how seriously Mexico's government and scientific community have taken the ongoing risk from this stretch of coastline, Guerrero Gap included, in the decades since. If you live in or have connections to coastal Guerrero, Mexico City, or the broader central Mexican region, here's what actually matters. First, understand and trust Mexico's seismic alert system if you live within its coverage area. It performed exactly as intended during January's earthquake, and knowing what to do the moment you hear that alert, moving away from windows, getting under sturdy furniture, or into a doorway, matters far more than the alert itself if you don't know how to react to it. Second, if you're in coastal Guerrero specifically, particularly in or around San Marcos and the broader area affected by January's earthquake, be aware that a substantial, still ongoing aftershock sequence has continued for months since the main shock, with thousands of recorded events. Structures that sustained even minor damage during the original quake may be more vulnerable to further stress from continued aftershock activity. And it's worth having any visibly damaged buildings professionally assessed rather than assuming they're fine simply because they're still standing. Third, if you live in Mexico City, remember that the capital's specific soil conditions mean earthquakes originating well outside the city, along virtually any part of this coastal subduction zone, can still produce meaningfully amplified shaking locally. That's not a reason for constant anxiety. But it is a reason to treat your own household's earthquake preparedness, secured furniture, a clear sense of safe spots in your home, and familiarity with the seismic alert system's warning tone as a genuinely ongoing priority rather than a box you checked once years ago. And fourth, if this story has your attention, it's worth understanding that the Guerrero Gap's eventual behavior, whenever more data clarifies it, will likely first show up not as a single dramatic headline, but as a gradual accumulation of research findings. Exactly the kind of incremental scientific progress we've walked through today. Following credible seismological sources directly, rather than relying on dramatic secondhand claims, is the more reliable way to actually track this story as it develops. So here's where this stands as of today. A magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck near San Marcos, Guerrero on January 2nd of this year, killing 2 people, damaging or destroying hundreds of buildings, and triggering Mexico City's seismic alert system nearly 170 miles away, all occurring at the edge of the Guerrero Seismic Gap, one of the most intensively studied stretches of quiet fault anywhere on the Ring of Fire, a segment that hasn't produced a major magnitude 7+ earthquake since 1911, despite sitting directly beside fault segments responsible for some of Mexico's most devastating historical earthquakes. Scientists continue to study this gap's unusual behavior, its tendency to release stress through slow, largely silent slip events rather than conventional ruptures, using specialized offshore instrumentation. While in a study published just this year confirmed that even the physical structure of the incoming oceanic plate doesn't fully explain why this one segment behaves so differently from everything around it. Whether January's earthquake meaningfully connects to that century-long puzzle remains a genuinely open scientific question, one that will take careful, ongoing analysis to properly answer. I'll be tracking the continued aftershock sequence from January's earthquake, and I'll follow any new research emerging on the Guerrero Gap's behavior, as scientists continue working to understand one of the more genuinely puzzling open questions in earthquake science today. If breakdowns like this help you understand the real science behind a place, this consequential, subscribe, because I'll have the update the moment this picture meaningfully shifts. I'll see you in the next one.